The moment my coworker's face went pale in front of 47 people, I finally exhaled. She had spent 6 months trying to bury me. It took her exactly 11 seconds to bury herself. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I spent 3 years building something real inside a company that had already decided I was invisible, and the person sitting 2 desks away from me had decided she wanted credit for all of it. Let me take you back to the beginning. I joined Callaway and Marsh Financial Consulting fresh out of grad school at 26. I had a master's in data analytics, 2 internships, and the kind of naive optimism that makes older colleagues smile in a way that isn't entirely kind. The firm was mid-sized, ambitious, the type of place where if you kept your head down and produced results, you could move up fast. That's what they told me in the interview. That's what I believed. My direct manager was a woman named Director Holloway Sharp, measured, always 3 steps ahead in any conversation. She intimidated me in the best way. I wanted to impress her more than I wanted anything else that first year. My coworker, I'll call her my coworker because that's genuinely all she ever was to me, had been at the firm 4 years longer than me. She sat in the glass-walled office directly across from my cubicle. She was the kind of person who knew everyone's name on the executive floor, who laughed at the right moments, who somehow always had a coffee in her hand when she walked into a meeting with a senior partner. Her name was Renata. I'll use it because she doesn't deserve the protection of anonymity. Renata introduced herself to me on my first day with a smile that I spent too long mistaking for warmth. She told me which coffee machine on the 3rd floor had the best espresso, warned me that the parking garage elevator was slow on Thursdays for some reason nobody had ever explained, and offered to walk me through the internal reporting system so I wouldn't have to bother IT. I thought she was kind. I was 26 and I thought she was being kind. What she was actually doing was making an early calculation, that I was going to be useful. The project that changed everything was called the Meridian account. Callaway and Marsh had spent 2 years trying to bring in Meridian Healthcare as a client. They were a regional hospital network with $340 million in assets that needed restructuring guidance. Landing them would be the biggest account the firm had seen in a decade. Director Holloway put together a small team. She chose me as lead analyst. She chose Renata as the client liaison mostly because Renata had an existing relationship with Meridian's CFO from a conference 3 years earlier. I want to be precise about what that meant in practice. Renata attended the client dinners. Renata sent the check-in emails. Renata was the face. I was the one who built the actual framework. I worked nights and weekends for 4 months straight developing a proprietary risk analysis model that the partners had never seen anything like. I have the timestamps on every file. I have the version history. I have emails where Director Holloway specifically praised my methodology and asked me to prepare it for the final board presentation. What I did not have, and this is where I was naive, was any formal documentation making clear to Meridian's leadership that the work had come from me specifically. Renata was the liaison. She translated the work to the client. And somewhere in that translation, she started referring to the model as the framework I've been developing. The first time I heard her say it, I thought it was a slip. We were on a call with Meridian's CFO. I was on mute as a secondary analyst, and Renata said, "The framework I've been developing gives us a 3-point projection on the restructuring timeline." I sat up in my chair. I unmuted to add context, and she smoothly talked over me, said, "My analyst has some supporting data," and moved on. My analyst. I was 28 years old, and I sat in that chair afterward for a long time. I raised it with her that afternoon, calmly. I told her I'd noticed she was describing the model in ways that made it sound like her own work, and that I wanted to make sure our contributions were clearly attributed in the final presentation. She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as patient disappointment, the way you might look at someone who has just said something slightly embarrassing at a dinner party. She told me I was being territorial. She told me that on a team, individual credit was less important than the relationship with the client. She told me Director Holloway understood who did what. "You're not going to get anywhere being precious about this," she said. She said it gently, which was the part that stung the most. I went back to my desk and I made a decision. I didn't confront her again. I didn't go to Director Holloway, because I had no proof yet and Renata had 4 more years at this firm than me, and a relationship with half the senior partners. What I did instead was start keeping records. Every email, every Slack message, every annotated draft I sent her. I started CCing Director Holloway's assistant on update summaries, not the full work, just enough to establish a paper trail of who was producing what. I dated everything. I created a shared folder in the firm's cloud system with access logs that automatically recorded who opened and edited files. I also quietly reached out to my graduate school advisor, who happened to have published research on financial risk modeling methodology. I asked if he'd be willing to review my framework on an informal basis, not as a formal endorsement, just a private conversation I could document if I ever needed to demonstrate independent intellectual origin. He agreed. We did a video call. I saved the recording. 3 months later, Meridian signed with Callaway and Marsh. It was the biggest account the firm had seen since 2017. Director Holloway sent a congratulations email to the whole team. There was a small celebration in the conference room on the 14th floor with catered food and the kind of champagne that signals real money. At the celebration, I watched Renata accept handshakes from senior partners. I watched her laugh with the managing director, a man named Mr. Callaway Jr., who had his father's last name and approximately a quarter of his father's patience for incompetence. I watched her tell a story about the months of work I put into the risk model, and I watched two partners nod with genuine admiration. I ate a piece of catered bruschetta and I smiled and I waited, because 2 weeks earlier, Director Holloway had told me something important. She told me Meridian wanted a formal presentation at their Q1 board meeting, not just a report, but a live walkthrough of the methodology for their board of directors. 14 people in a room, including their CEO, their CFO, their head of legal, and 3 independent board members. It was the kind of presentation that could define careers. Director Holloway told me she wanted me to lead it. Renata was in the room when she said this. I watched Renata's expression stay perfectly composed, and I knew exactly what she was going to do next. She started working on it within the hour. I know this because we shared a server. I saw the file she created. She titled it Meridian, Q1, Board, Presentation, RV, her initials, and she started restructuring my model's explanations in her own language, not changing the underlying work, which she didn't fully understand, but rewriting the narrative framing so that this methodology became the approach I designed. I didn't touch her file. I let her build it. I kept working on my own version, the accurate one, with all the technical precision the board members would actually need. And I documented the divergence between the 2 files with timestamps. 10 days before the board meeting, Renata went to Director Holloway. I know what she said because Director Holloway told me, somewhat carefully, that Renata had expressed concern about my readiness to present to a board-level audience, that I was technically strong but perhaps not polished enough for a room of that seniority, that she, Renata, had been managing the client relationship from the start, and it might be smoother, better for the firm if she led the live presentation while I provided technical support in the room. Director Holloway told me this, and then she paused and she looked at me in a way that I think was giving me an opportunity to respond. Can I share some documentation with you? I asked. I sent Director Holloway everything that evening. The version history showing I had built the model from scratch over 4 months before Renata's file even existed. The email thread where Director Holloway herself had responded to my methodology draft with, "This is exactly the kind of thinking that's going to win this account." The access logs, the record of my advisor's informal review. I did not editorialize, I just organized the evidence clearly, labeled everything, and let it speak. Then I waited again. Director Holloway did not remove Renata from the project. That would have been disruptive, and Director Holloway was a practical woman. What she did was schedule a pre-presentation dry run, a full walkthrough of the board presentation with both of us in the room, along with 2 senior partners. "So we can ensure the delivery is polished," she said in the calendar invite. "Both of you will present your sections." Renata had no idea this was anything other than a rehearsal. The dry run was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 10 days after I sent Director Holloway the documentation. I arrived early. The 2 senior partners were already there, along with Director Holloway. Renata arrived 2 minutes before start time, composed as always, her presentation clicker in her hand. "We were going to co-present," Director Holloway explained. "Renata would handle client relationship context and high-level overview. I would walk through the methodology." Renata opened with confidence. She was good at that, the setup, the framing, the language that made people feel like they were in capable hands. She described the Meridian engagement, the scope of the work, the relationship the firm had built. She was smooth and professional, and I watched the 2 senior partners nodding along. Then she transitioned to the model. "The risk analysis framework," she said, clicking to the methodology slide. was built on a 3-variable projection system that I developed specifically for healthcare asset structures. One of the senior partners, a man named Mr. Ferris, who had actually read my documentation because Director Holloway had forwarded it to him the week before, looked up from his notepad. "Can you walk us through the derivation?" he asked. "Specifically, the weighting algorithm on the 3rd variable. I had some questions about how you arrived at those coefficients." Renata smiled. Of course. She looked at the slide. The room was very quiet. The weighting algorithm on the 3rd variable was the part I had spent 3 weeks on. It was based on a modified regression approach that I had developed in graduate school and adapted for this specific use case. It was not something you could reverse engineer by reading the output. You had to have built it. "The coefficients," Renata started, "were determined based on the overall risk profile. The specific derivation, Mr. Ferris said, not unkindly. "How did you get to those numbers?" Renata's smile stayed in place for approximately 4 more seconds. Then something shifted in her face. Something very small but completely visible to everyone in that room. "The technical specifics, were a collaborative process," she said. "The team contributed." "Which part did you personally derive?" Mr. Ferris asked. I watched Renata look at the slide. I watched her look at Director Holloway. I watched her understand. It's not a neutral. I pulled up my own documentation on the shared screen, the original model files, the methodology notes, the dated drafts. I spent 12 minutes walking through the weighting algorithm with the precision of someone who had built it from nothing at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night 6 months earlier. When I finished, Mr. Ferris said, "That's what I needed. Thank you." Director Holloway thanked us both and closed the meeting. Renata and I walked out of the conference room together. She didn't say anything. I didn't say anything either. I had nothing left to prove. The next morning, Director Holloway called me into her office and told me I would be the sole lead presenter at the Meridian board meeting. She also told me the firm would be recognizing my contribution to the account in writing. She said this in the careful language of someone who has already decided something and is now making it official. Renata was reassigned to a different account the following week. Not fired, reassigned. I'm sure she found her footing somewhere else. People like Renata are adaptable. They find new rooms to be impressive in, new people to translate other people's work for. But she didn't get to do it with mine. The Meridian board meeting was on a Tuesday in March. 14 people in a room on the 22nd floor of a building in downtown Charlotte. I stood at the head of the table with my laptop and my notes, and 3 years of work behind me that had finally, firmly, been put on the record as mine. The presentation took 40 minutes. Meridian's CEO asked 4 questions. Her head of legal asked 2. At the end, their CFO, the same man who had known Renata from that conference years ago, leaned back in his chair and said, "This is genuinely impressive work. The firm is lucky to have you." I thanked him. I meant it. And then I walked back out into the hallway and I stood by the elevator bank for a moment by myself, looking at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, feeling something I didn't have a clean word for. Not just relief. Not just satisfaction. Something quieter. The feeling of a thing being made right after a very long time of watching it be wrong. I thought about the version of me that had sat in her cubicle 2 years earlier listening to Renata say, "You're not going to get anywhere being precious about this." I thought about how that version of me had gone home that night and not slept well and wondered if she was right. Whether the way this industry worked meant you just had to accept that the people with the louder voices got the credit and the people who did the actual work were supposed to be grateful for the proximity. I had decided very quietly that she was not right. And I had spent 2 years proving it the only way that actually holds, not by arguing, not by confronting, but by documenting everything and waiting for the room where the truth would have to either speak for itself or be exposed. When I got back to the office that afternoon, there was an email from Director Holloway with 3 senior partners copied. It outlined my role in the Meridian engagement in formal language that would become part of the project record. It used the phrase primary architect of the methodology. It used my name 11 times. I read it twice. I forwarded it to my personal email. Then I closed my laptop and went and got coffee from the 3rd floor machine, the good one, the one Renata had told me about on my very first day, and I stood by the window for a few minutes just drinking it. I have been at Callaway and Marsh for 3 years now. Meridian renewed their contract 6 months ago and asked specifically for continuity in their analytical team. I'm up for senior analyst in the next review cycle. Director Holloway told me last month that she's recommending me without reservation. I don't think about Renata very often, but sometimes, When I'm finishing a piece of work I know is genuinely good, I think about that afternoon in the dry run, the specific moment when Mr. Ferris asked her to explain the weighting algorithm and the smile held for 4 seconds and then didn't. I think about how she had built her whole strategy around the assumption that the work would keep speaking in her voice, that she would keep being the one in the room, that I would eventually get tired of being quiet about it. She miscalculated on every single count. Do the work. Document everything. Choose your moment and don't move until it's right. And if someone ever looks at you across a desk and tells you that you'll never get anywhere being precious about what belongs to you, smile, say nothing, and go home and save every single file.